we've been talking about how the heavenly bodies are there as signs for the regulation of religious life on the planet. And I gave examples from Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Baha'i, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, Judaism. There's another example I'll give from Judaism, and it is one of the days on the calendar. Again, it is related to the Hebrew lunar calendar, around which there is a lot of charged emotion and energy. I'm talking about Tisha B'Av, which is the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av. Av is one of the lunar months in the Hebrew calendar. And in a previous episode, quite a ways back, I did mention how the Hebrew calendar was almost musically attuned. It bore a relationship to the diatonic scale in terms of when they add extra months to their years. So the first month of their year is Nisan. At the time of the Passover, this was going to be designated the first month of the year. And the new moons are called Rosh Chodesh, which means the head of the month. So that gives you an idea that a month begins at the new moon. Because universally we see that people engaged in spiritual and religious practices see the new moon as a time of beginnings. For example, in Buddhism, Buddha taught that every developed understanding begins with a seed of a thought, begins with a little realization, a little insight. But you need to take that insight and nurture it, like a seedling in a greenhouse, until it develops into a fully fledged understanding, which the full moon symbolizes. So back to the Hebrew calendar, you've got your Nisan as the first, and halfway down the year you've got your 7th month, Tishrei, and a lot happens in that month, including Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, 10 days into Tishrei. So the Jews often do this. You've got a lunation period, but they'll count days into it, and certain feasts, certain readings of the Torah will come at certain days in that period. Well, with Tisha B'Av, they've noted a particular day in their history, which is shot through with sadness, grief, but it's also a day that is commemorated. It's the 9th day in their month of Av. So the month of Av will usually be in July, August. So the 9th day of Av could fall in July or in August. It'll vary from year to year. It just fell yesterday, for example, in 2024. It won't be yesterday by your viewing this, but yesterday at the yesterday from today, which is the day of my recording this. And I noticed that there were some ructions and some provocative events that were happening on the Al-Aqsa compound as the security minister, Ben-Gvir, led Jews singing a lot of hymns and displacing Muslims and just generally sort of laying claim to that holy site, because it is a Temple Mount for the Jews, but it's also the third holiest site for the Muslims after Mecca and Medina. So it is a potential flashpoint. Provocations, God help us, I hope they don't, have consequences. But to understand how this works with, and the Jewish people are aware of this, to understand how it works with Tisha B'Av, we go right back to the beginning. The first Tisha B'Av was when Moses sent some scouts into the land of Canaan to scout out the territory and to see if the land could be taken. There were 12 scouts representing the 12 tribes of Israel, and when they came back, 10 of them gave a dismal report, and only 2, Joshua and Caleb, were positive about the prospects of taking the land. The other 10, they were intimidated by the size of the people. All were impressed by the fertility of the land and the size of the fruit and so on, climate. But 10 of them were intimidated. The people were big and they looked fearsome, and they didn't think that the Israelites would be able to take them out. Well, the Bible tells us that God, the consequence of this faithlessness, I suppose, or lack of optimistic crusading spirit, meant none of those 10 people made it to the promised land. Only Joshua and Caleb. And in fact, all of that generation died out and didn't make it to the promised land. Not even Moses himself, but Moses had done something to offend God in another situation. So Moses died without entering the promised land. That was the original Tisha B'Av. So an action taken by the people had certain consequences. Fast forward to 586 BC. And on this date, the 9th day of Av, in that year, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar destroys the temple in Jerusalem. This was the first temple built by King Solomon. And it had been standing for about 400 years, the great Solomonic temple. And you can imagine what a devastating blow it was to the Israelites. That is the center of worship. That's where Yahweh meets his people, in the temple. And it was destroyed on that date. So it became a day of lament, a day of grief, a day of remembering loss. Fast forward another half millennium to 70 AD, and we have the destruction of the second temple. Because after this first temple, the Jews were taken into captivity in Babylon. Then they were released by the Persian king Cyrus to go back and rebuild the temple under Zerubbabel. That second temple was then renovated by King Herod just before Jesus was born, or up to the time of Jesus. And Jesus prophesied the ending of that second temple. Not a stone would be left upon another stone. For the unfortunate Jews, it was a catastrophe that struck on the 9th of Av in the year 70 AD under the Roman forces commanded by Titus. And the temple was destroyed again, just as the first temple had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. There were revolts after that of the Jewish people against the Romans. And the most significant and the sort of culminating revolt was the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 130s of the Common Era. When it finally was broken and the Jewish people were persecuted quite fiercely by the Romans, it was the 9th of Av again, Tisha B'Av, 135 or whatever the date of the failure of the Shimon Bar Kokhba rebellion was. And after that, the diaspora took place, the exile fully took place, and the Jews wandered throughout the world. And it wasn't easy. And they had a hard time. And it was so difficult to find a home. And they'd go to countries, of course, and there'd be friction between them and the local people. There were a huge number of expulsions from lands, European countries, England, France, Spain, other countries. Some of the critical ones happened on the 9th of Av. For example, the Jews were expelled from England in the year 1290 at Tisha B'Av. And then only 16 years later, they were expelled from France on that date. Now, you could say it's a coincidence, but there are things mitigating against that. The day has resonance, and resonant days tend to carry with them their own energy. Besides which, powerful opponents of the Jewish people would be mindful of the 9th of Av as well. And if they are delivering any retribution or setting a limit to the activity of the Jews, they may choose to use that date as well. So we don't have to think of this as a series of coincidences. The expulsion of the Jews from Iberia, Spain and Portugal, in 1492 was just a couple of days before Tisha B'Av. It was a big exile. So a very hard life, moving around from place to place, not being able to trust the people that you're with and they not being able to trust you. This has been part of the Jewish destiny. But then in modern times, insult has been added to injury as well. They believe that the Nazi formulation of the final solution happened on Tisha B'Av, which is a horrendous thought.
Absolutely.
And before that Second World War, I think that was 1941, but before that, the First World War was enjoined from Germany's action on Tisha B'Av, which, again, both world wars, but especially the second, of course, had enormous catastrophic consequences for the Jewish people. So this date is a special date, and it has resonances, and some of the consequences that follow have been visited upon the Jewish people, tragically, sadly, on this date. And the prophets warned them, like Jeremiah warned them about the exile that was coming, the loss of the first temple. There's no point in resisting the Babylonian king because you hadn't been faithful to Yahweh and kept the covenant and turned to other gods and idolatry. This was the price to be paid. This was a consequence, like a karmic reaction. Between Israel and Yahweh, there's an understanding. And this date seems to be a very symbolic date in communicating these things. So this is a shorter transmission. I will just keep it to the illustration of this particular day. And we'll just end it by praying and hoping for peace for the world and for justice for all peoples. And the peace that the world needs necessarily entails justice. It can't happen if there is injustice. And the peace that the world needs also must be cognizant of the faith traditions, of the claims of the faith traditions, and how they can relate, how they can be true interreligious, civil, peaceful, verbal, diplomatic resolutions of some of the conflicts. And it is my hope, my fervent hope, that the practice of true religion can contribute to the building of such a peace. And when we commit to communicating openly and fairly, we can hopefully find some common ground in our religious understandings, which will then affect political change. And as I've indicated before, so much of the war that is engulfing the Middle East and threatening to spiral out of all control has to do with religious fundamentalism on both sides. And it also has to do with divergent interpretations of Scripture. So I think it is completely unrealistic that any lasting solution is going to be found to this problem by sidelining religion. So here's praying and hoping for peace and justice.